And this area is rich in coal. One of the richest areas from here all the way to the Arkansas border east of here, 100 miles, is one of the richest areas in Oklahoma in coal. Still billions of tons of coal down below us. And the majority of the Italians that came here and worked in the mines were from central Italy, between Rome and Naples, where there wasn't a lot of industry, and economic conditions were pretty depressed, and the political situation there was pretty repressive at the time. They came here looking for a better life. Could go to work in the coal mines, not have to have skills, and if they would work their tail off, they could make a living for their family. So they found work here. They brought with them their customs and their food, their cuisine, their ways of life. In Italy and a lot of the other countries, it's not something that's really looked down on or anything. They have beer, wine, whatever, with meals and family meals. Of course, all these different nationalities brought with them their beer, wine, whatever making skills. It was an escape. Life was pretty rough back then, so the men especially, I guess, on weekends, on Sundays, whatever, when you didn't have to go to work, they would, and some of them at other times, they would had a way to escape some of the roughness of life back then, which was drink a little bit of beer.
Well, the way this whole story is told, you know, the immigrants, when they came over here, it was originally Choc Beer. It was Choctaw beer as much. It was an Indian recipe. And the immigrants got it, and they changed it around, and they just shortened it to Choc. And they actually had to sell it to make ends meet. You know, they worked in the coal mines, and I guess every Italian family in Cribs at one time or another, except my dad never did sell it, but several of them did. And in fact, my wife's grandpa, he had to go to the federal penitentiary in Muskogee for 6 months because he sold it and they caught him with it. And he, bless his heart, he couldn't speak a word English. He's an Italian immigrant. But it was rough back then. I mean, for ends meet, they had to, hell, they say stories had it, they might work for 50 cents a day. Can you imagine that? You tell the kids today about that and they laugh at you. But it was a reality back then. So that's how Choc Beer got started. And we had Choc Beer at home all my life. And when I was a teenager, that was one of my chores, other than milking cows too. I had 3 cows to milk every day. But I'm glad my parents made me do what I did, made me the man I am today. I mean, you know, everything I got, I worked for.
Southeastern Oklahoma was Choctaw Nation in the Indian Nation. And the story is, one of the stories is that the Indians taught the immigrants how to make beer. It was called Choc Beer, but I'm pretty sure that when they came here, they knew how to make beer and wine already. Now, not taking anything away from the Native Americans, I'm sure they like to make their hooch too, you know, and they did. They used, I think they probably used corn, maize, to make theirs, but these people put everything together and it just developed the name of Choc Beer. Now, I have no idea if it's called Choc Beer in other parts of the country or not. But that's one of the stories, is that it was named because of the Choctaw Nation, Choc being short for Choctaw.
I know that my grandpa, whenever he got hurt in the coal mines in the 50s, I believe it was in the 50s, and he had to figure out a way to make a living, and so he would make choc, and they would at nighttime go and hit these creeks before Lake Eufaula went in, and they would catch tow sacks of frogs, and they would sell the Choc Beer and the frog legs, and that's basically the way he made his living. And he had 2 of these, and they're copper wash tubs. I've never seen one before. Going to all the antique shops, you can see that he drilled it, and he used tar right here. Now, I know that's probably a no-no today. You would probably something poisonous come out of that. But that's why he made beer, and he had it setting up on the stove, he had it up on the stove probably about this high. He built him a deal. And so whenever he'd fill that full of the hops and the barley in here, like we showed you in there, he would hook a hose on this, and he would just drain it over into this. He had 2 of these.
This hops has been in business for years and years. My dad used to use the same brand.
Was your dad the one that taught you how to make it?
Well, when I was a teenager, that was my job.
Yeah.
When he was making beer, us kids would have to do it.
They made it different. They had, a lot of things. When you make beer, temperature has a lot to do with it. And if they didn't have it in the, especially in the summertime, it wouldn't be as good as it was made in the winter. And so, a lot of times the beer wasn't as good as, it wasn't a consistent thing. Like, nowadays when people make commercially, it's got to be consistent all the time. But you just never knew how it was going to turn out. I mean, it was, for the most part, it was good, but sometimes it was better than others. And if you've ever tried to make beer, you know what I'm talking about. It changes a lot with temperature.
And a lot of them cook their beer in these big cast iron pots in the yard same pots that they made soap in or would wash clothes in sometime, or scald chickens to get them ready for Sunday dinner. They'd wash the pot out and they'd make beer right there in it, which was, I don't know how many people's familiar with that, but every yard in Krebs just about had one of these cast iron pots that would be about 2.5, 3 feet in diameter, set into a brick or rock structure, and you just build a fire under it, and that's where you would do all of and you do it outside so the house wouldn't get hot. They'd make beer out in the yard even, but they'd have to kind of hide that when the authorities were apt to. And if you were driving by and you were cooking grain to make beer, and you knew what it smelled like, you would know what was going on.
But while we was growing up, I helped Dad out here on the farm, and like I say, did the chores as far as making chalk for him and helping him make wine. And the wine deal I didn't pay too much attention to, and I kicked my rear for not now, because Dad made real good wine. But it was just something when you were a kid, it was something you had to do and you didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
And you didn't want to know about it. And just like my dad was a butcher. And now when I kill a deer, I can't hardly clean it because I never paid attention. I didn't want to know because I had to help him. I was made to do it. Yeah. But it was just one of those things you didn't want to know. Yeah. Now I wish I did. Yeah. But I was smarter back then than I am today, see.
Yeah.
I knew everything then.
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Like they all did.
So you get older and you realize you don't know.
I thought my daddy was the dumbest man on earth, and come find out he was the smartest man I ever knew.
It was made right. When you pop the top, the capper, blue smoke comes out. And I told Joe that'd be a great name for one of his beers. Call it Blue Smoke, because it's when you see that blue smoke come out of it, it's going to be good.
But if you got that bottle too full, you'd have to pour it off in a cup. So I'm bottling along here. When that cup filled up, I just sit there and drink it. That's the way Daddy did, and I thought that's the way I was supposed to do it too. And I sat there and I went to filling some of them bottles up on purpose. And they got done, and most generally they was home by 4 o'clock in the evening. But anyway, I got done there around 3 o'clock. I cleaned up everything, got the wood barrel washed out and filled up with water, let it soak. I was drunk. It was 1953. I was 10 years old. I was drunk. And I went to bed. And I didn't wake up the next morning. They come and got me out of bed, time to go to church. I don't know if they knew that I was drunk or what, but I sure did sleep a whole bunch. Slept quite a while. And I don't know if Mama or Daddy caught on to that or not, but Daddy, I got up, my mouth was dry, and go get me, back then we had well water, went and got me a dip of that water, and I was drunk all over again. I said, Jesus Christ. Then he made me go to church.
I'm going to put about 5 pounds of barley in here for 15 gallons of beer. This hops right here is what they used back in the older days. And this is true Choc hops, what my grandpa used and what all the old timers used. I prefer this hops. It has a little smoother taste. So this is what makes it Polanders Brew. And after it boils for 2.5 hours, I take and I dip it out of here. And before I dip it into this 30-gallon crock right here, I'll take and put 20 pounds of sugar in this 30-gallon crock. And then whenever I get that sugar in there, then I'll take this out and I'll get this. I've got a deal here that I use. And I'll dip it out of here. And I pour it over in here. When it gets down to about 80 degrees, then it's ready to put your yeast in there. And I'll take and I'll put regular yeast that the wise make bread with. And it's not the rapid rise, it's just the regular rise yeast. And I'll put 6 of these to 30 gallons. And this is the hydrometer right here. And when I first put this in here, whenever you first put it in there and it's about 80 degrees, it'll be about on this orange line right here. And then as it works, it falls into the beer further and further until it gets down to 1.000. And when it gets to that point, it's ready to bottle. The longest process is washing all these bottles. That's the hardest part of making beer. And my grandpa would give you a good old-fashioned cussing if you brought his bottles back dirty.
Yeah.
If you didn't rinse that bottle out, if you took beer home and brought his bottles, it better be rinsed out because that chalk will sit up in the bottom, those drugs will, and it's a pain to get them clean.
Yeah, we used to, during from the 30s on, there used to be a lot of houses around cribs that would serve chalk because there was, Prohibition, and there was no, and then even after the late 50s, whenever the state went wet, there were still a lot of people who sold chalk in their houses. It was kind of a tradition. Plus, the beer was probably better than 3 beer. So when I was a kid in the early 60s, there was probably 10 or 15 houses around cribs that would still, people could come in their house and drink chalk. So therefore, they bought the malt from my dad, who'd get it in 100-pound bags. And then we would deliver it all over town once or twice a week to these different chalk joints. And when you walked in, it was nothing for them to say, even to a 12 or 14-year-old kid, would you like a glass of chalk, Sammy? And I didn't think anything of it in those days, but I would never do that today to one of my, to someone come to my house. It was just a totally different time.
Oh, we had one lady here all back in the 80s there. Just pretty close to Levere's there. We'd go over her house. He'd go over her house anytime. And pay $1 for a bottle of chalk. But you went into her house, she had a little den sort of sitting off the side of her kitchen there that went outside, and that's where we all stayed. It held about 5 or 6 of us. I mean, there wouldn't be no swarm of us, but she said we kept her in business till she passed away. And pretty much this is pretty much where me and my cousin really got our recipes was from her.
There were, I think Ruth Fabrizio had really great beer. And the most known place, the most business was a place called a Polish guy named Mike Polcheny. They used to call him the Polander, and there would be senators, lawyers, hang out after work to go there. And this place would look like Fred Sanford's place, Sanford and Sons. It was junky, but they would go there, and he always had, lots of 3 for $1, 3 quarts for $1. And those guys would go after work, and they would judges, lawyers, doctors, white collar, blue collar workers, anybody. It was this real mix of people. And some of the stories you could hear from that place, you could not, in a million years, ever depict it. You couldn't. There's no way anybody could capture that place. It was just such a colorful thing.
Now, as a little kid, we'd go down there. I was probably about 5 years old, and we'd go down to his house, and his living room was turned into a bar. And he had a table, 4 or 5 tables in the center of the living room, and they had chairs at it, and it'd be full of men. I'm talking about people, real important people, as Gene Stipes, Carl Albert, and a whole lot of people from Krebs, McAllister, and they were sitting there drinking that Choc, and he didn't actually sell it to them. This was his way of getting around it. He had a donation can sitting next to the icebox. He just knew to get 3 quarts out of that icebox, it was $1. And 3 quarts, you probably didn't want to drive home after 3 quarts. I'm sure they did though back then, but they didn't drive far. But a lot of people walked down there. If you lived in Krebs, you walked, and they'd walk down there and walk home. Now, if they found their way home, I don't know, but they eventually did. They might have slept in the bar ditch 2 times.
But we'd go to Ruthie's and drink beer, and then if it was a bad day, you would probably leave there drunk. No doubt. Wondered how you gonna get home. And my cousin one Saturday morning there, we was gonna butcher hogs and had the water ready and everything, and they said the sleet storm was a-coming. We didn't believe them. But the sleet storm come. We didn't butcher the hogs. They said, well, let's just go to Ruthie's. Me and him together drank 15 quarts of Choc. That was
Somebody
bad.
got slaughtered.
I don't know if we'd left his house or we met over there or what, but I don't remember getting home that day. It was a bad deal. Well, there wasn't nothing else to do.
Is that Ruthie Fabrizio?
Uh-huh. No, she's a distant relative. Mm.
We used to make it in an old iron pot outside. And they used to have to clean that thing out because it sat outside all the time. You'd build a fire under that pot, and then you get the water boiling, and you'd have a kind of like a pillowcase is what they used back then. You put the grain in it and your hops, and you'd put it in there, and sometime you would have to tie it up and put a stick across the top of it because it didn't have a lid, because if you didn't, it would sink, and the bag would go down at the bottom, it would burn. So you had to tie it up to keep it afloat. And cook it about the same amount of time, about 3 hours, and then you'd take that bag out, throw it in the chicken yard, and the chickens would eat the grain, and it had no alcohol content to it at that time. And let it cool off, and then you would dip it out of that big iron pot into a tub and get somebody to help you to carry it down the basement and put it in a fermenting jar and start it, and it stayed down there in the basement. And when it got ready, you'd bottle it down there, put it up on the shelf in the basement there. And as you wanted it, you brought it up to the house and put it in the refrigerator. We always had beer to drink there. Dad always told me, you drink it at home, you don't drink it nowhere else. That's the way it was. Same way with wine.
Why was that?
Didn't want me to go off getting drunk somewhere,
Okay.
which we did every once in a while anyway. You know how that goes.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, they all sold it, they just couldn't get caught doing it. Because it was illegal, and it's still illegal, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, Pete Pritchard got started at Pete's Place restaurant when he would have friends come over. This is a story that was told to me. And they would drink beer, and then a couple of guys say, hey, Pete, you got something to eat? And he said, well, I might have something over here. And you have a piece of cold chicken or something. So he started cooking a little bit for them when they would come. And it got to be more and more. Fried chicken, cook some pasta, meatballs and such as that. And then they would pay him for the food. And he decided, well, hell, I might just start serving food. And that's how he started his restaurant from that.
So Pete comes over, works in the mines, gets hurt. And so he decides, you know, he doesn't have a lot of options. It's 1920s. The sort of the social welfare, even like insurance systems, things like that. They either don't exist or they're not available to him. So he starts selling beer and food, and now he's already making the beer, people of the area have learned how to make this Choc beer from the Indians of the area. And so he starts selling the beer, makes it in his basement, like I was telling you, in the bathtub, and sells it out of his house. That becomes a restaurant. Now, it's all illegal. This is 1925. This is Prohibition. So, you know, just the sale of alcohol is illegal, much less the manufacture out of your house for sale. That's like really illegal. So he does have some run-ins with the law, but really the thing that sort of distinguishes him from a lot of other people and really allowed his brewery and restaurant business to thrive and grow, and I can't speak in too many particulars about this, but was his ability to sort of work with the authorities. Because this was a fairly robust business. He was well known, his operation was well known, the fact you get Choc Beer was well known. But with that being said, and he did get arrested a few times. We have a federal arrest warrant that hangs in the restaurant in Pete's place, but he never went to jail for any serious length of time. They were always sort of minor offenses. So, you know, he would get arrested, but it wasn't, definitely did get into the kind of trouble he could have. And that has to be attributed to the fact that, you know, his ability to work with the people that were in charge and the law enforcement officials, and to some degree their desire to also have some beer, you know.
There were a couple of places in Krebs where people made Choc, and you could go get some from them, and they didn't get bothered. Things had calmed down, and they wouldn't do it in a great big way. But and some of them, the lawyers and the judges would go there to drink beer. They'd have a little area set up where they could go drink beer, so they were kind of protected.
Probably a lot of important decisions and important political meetings in the history of the state have been carried out while the participants engaged in drinking Choc Beer. And probably the place where it happened the most was at Krebs, and going back to Pete's place at Krebs, which was a favorite gathering place. I still go there occasionally, and I'm happy to say a very faded picture of me is still on the walls from my looking about 40 years younger than I do now. And so for years people have gathered there and they've had these conversations. It was kind of part of tradition.
There was one other place other than Mike, the Polander they called him, and he had an honor system too, and they really paid attention. He would go out and be tearing houses down. He's always working on the outside. He'd leave his house open. Had one great big room, Choc room, that they would go in there and drink. And a lot of big dignitaries. Gene Stipe was one of them. And a lot of the other big shots in town, lawyers and doctors, and all go over there. And it had an honor system. You had a deal up there where you put your money in. And he knew how many beers he put in that cooler that morning. And he come home and it had to match up with the money. Or he told him he would close the door. And they policed it themselves and let nobody short the deal.
Yeah.
He didn't short the cup or he didn't come back. But and then there's another lady called Ruth Fabrizio. She had the same thing. She had a room in the back of her house that people would go. But she was always there and sold beer. That's how they made their living. I mean, it's just the way it was. I don't think they was doing a damn thing wrong. It was just, you know, the greedy feds wouldn't leave them alone. They wasn't hurting nobody. It wasn't hurting nobody. So, but you know, that's just the way it was.
No, because one of the gentlemen just right north of the Catholic Church up there, he sold it, and then of course he had the lawyers and the doctors and one that part of the sheriff's department and everything. Everybody else come down there and they drank beer. But he had that cup sitting on there, and you waited on yourself. He would go outside and work in his garden or whatever. He had a big old junkyard out there, and people would come by and junk off of him or what have you, and then the door was open. You know, and I didn't know that, and it was back in the 60s there. Me and my daddy-in-law, we was working on a project, and he wanted to go down there and get I forgot what it was, a piece of Orangeburg pipe or something. And I said, well, heck, I'll just drink me a bottle of Choc down there. I went and knocked on the door. He opened the door there. He finally come to the door and chewed me out and cussed me out for knocking on the door. If you want a bottle of Choc, you don't knock on my door. You come in and get your chalk, and there's the can right there. And he knew who was there at all times. And he gave me a little scolding over that deal there. Don't knock, come on in, you know. And anyway, that was, and no, he never got caught. He was protected by the law, and the judge even went down there and drank beer with him, yeah. Everybody knew it.
And then when the authorities would come around, well, there were certain people that would let my grandpa know to put the all of his chalk making stuff up, and he'd put it up, and 4 or 5 days later, he'd go back to making it again. It's almost like having a still, you know, back during when they had whiskey and making the moonshine. Well, he was kind of the same way, you know, making this beer. But he wasn't the only one in Krebs. There was the Pecchios, and almost every house in Krebs, all your old Italians made Choc Beer. They may not have sold it, but they made it for their own use. Kind of like me. Make it for my own use, and then just, I want to keep up the tradition of knowing how to make it.
I can remember one of my cousins who passed away in the 90s at almost 100, telling me about when he was younger, that he would get very emotional about the authorities raiding a widow who was making beer to supplement her family's income, to support her family, help support her family, and they would raid her and tear up all of her equipment and break all the bottles and everything, maybe even try to fine her, I don't know, but he would get very emotional about that. I can remember my dad and my aunt talking about when they were kids, they'd be out playing on a day like today, and some kid would come by on a bicycle and say they're raiding so-and-so over there on the other side of town, and they'd jump on their bicycles and go over there, and the authorities would be breaking bottles out in the front yard. There'd be a big pile of glass in the front yard where they broke all the chalk bottles, busted up all the pans and stuff like that. So I guess to discourage them from making illegal hooch.
One of the things that really amused me is when I was governor, I appointed, there were a couple of very colorful people that served on the Pardon and Parole Board. I won't use their names, and served for a number of years, but I appointed a minister to the Pardon and Parole Board, among others, and I got calls from some of the other members that said, "You have ruined our social life." And I said, "What do you mean?" "By putting a minister on the Pardon and Parole Board, because now we can't go to Pete's and drink Choc Beer together with our minister there." And one of them said, "I'm a deacon in the church that he used to be the minister."
My wife's family still makes it, you know, for their own. They don't sell it; they just make it for themselves. And now my son's trying to learn to make. He lives in Oklahoma City now, and he's wanting to make it. I mean, these younger kids in their early 20s, they're wanting to kind of carry it on. But it's not only a neat tradition, but it's really good. It's better than 3-2 beer if you like beer.
Is maintaining the history of it, is that important to you?
That's important to me.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think I have some friends that love it, and, you know, that's come out here and helped George and I both bottle it, and we both have an interest in it. But, and just the camaraderie, I guess, that, you know, I don't care that I drank a bottle of it. I love George's friendship. Him and Phyllis both are like grandma and grandpa to me.
And like I say, all us kids like Donnie, Michael Pritchard, Rosanna's, my daughter used to be married to him. He makes it. Oh, there's several of them make it around town. Steve Crandall makes it. We all make it just for ourselves. Larry Facino, Nike Facino, they all make it. But there ain't no selling. Larry won't even let you leave a bottle leave his house. You go to his house, you drink it there, you leave his bottles there. He won't let his bottles get away. But you can go there and drink all the beer you want, but nobody sells nothing.
I'm sharing it with y'all. Y'all got the recipe down. I mean, the tradition needs to go on. It's gonna be forgotten. It will. It'll be forgotten. I bet another 20 years you couldn't find nobody that made chalk around here. Just about that. It's just, and years ago, every other house had it. You can go over any place or crib somebody's house and you can have a glass of chalk. Sure could.
It's far and in between now. The chalk makers are far and in between. They're not at every house now. We probably can find 10 or 15 people around McAllister that make it now. Where, you know, like I said, in Krebs, you can go any house and get it, probably. But today, people just don't do it. Times have changed.
And I remember that time I had that wild beer. You couldn't open it in the house. You'd take a cap off and go, pow! The cap would hit the ceiling and it'd come out of there like a fountain. So it's dangerous to grab them bottles and go outside. So I'd get a towel and wrap them up and I'd go at the edge of that porch and I'd lean them on it and flip it. It'd blow that cap plumb over that fence. And that beer just all come out of that bottle. Wonder they didn't break.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when they break, when they're like that.
Right.
I'm assuming I bottled it too soon, or I put too much sugar in the bottle when I charged it.
Yeah.
Either one would do it. Yeah. Either one would do it.
Yeah.
So.
You called it wild beer.
Yeah, wild beer. Yeah.
Because it was too hard to handle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't save it. It'd come out of that bottle. You couldn't save it.
Yeah.
Some of the old timers would get a pitcher and open it and turn it upside down in that pitcher and it'd just foam all out. You'd catch a little bit of it. But... Oh yeah, Phyllis's Uncle Peepee. They was trying to wean him from drinking because he was drinking too much and he made it all the time. His name was Joe, and we was living in Krebs then. So she decided, well, I'm gonna get that beer for George. They're gonna get it from Uncle Peepee and throw it away or break the bottles and all that. So she put a bunch of it in a tub. We just had bought this little brand new F-85 station wagon. She put that beer in the tub and had it in the back end there, you know. And didn't think nothing about it, I guess. Forgot about it. It blew up in that car. Cut little bitty marks in the headliner where that glass cut the headliner, and that car stunk for 6 months. That was the case. It was bottled okay, but it's sitting out in the sun like that was. If you'd left that in your car, you'd go out there and it'd all be on the top of the roof.
Yeah, I don't want that.
Yeah, it happened.